Welcome. If you're listening to this, you've chosen to spend the next 2 hours with us on a journey, not through excitement or urgency, but through time itself. This is a story without villains or heroes in the traditional sense. It has no sudden twists or dramatic crescendos. Instead, it is the slow, patient unfolding of change across millions of years. It is the story of how we came to be. You might be settling into bed right now, or perhaps you're lying in the dark, waiting for sleep to find you. Whatever your situation, know that you're safe. What we're about to explore together is both ancient and distant, and that distance itself is comforting. We're going to travel back, far back, to a time before there were cities, before there were languages, before there was anything resembling the world you know today. The history of human evolution is not a race toward something. It is not a ladder with us standing triumphantly at the top. Rather, it is a branching path, a slow adaptation to changing environments, a gradual accumulation of small changes across countless generations. Each ancestor, you might imagine, was simply living their life, unaware they were part of something vast and unfolding. Imagine yourself for a moment as a window through time. You are looking back through your parents, and their parents before them. Go back further, and you'll find relatives who were different from you. Keep going, and you'll find cousins. Continue still, and you'll find ancestors who are not quite human. This journey backward is what awaits us. There is something deeply comforting about understanding that we are part of a continuum, that our existence is the natural result of millions of years of slow change. We are not separate from nature. We are nature observing itself. And so, as you settle in for this long narrative, let yourself drift with the rhythm of deep time. The story we're about to tell spans roughly 7 million years from our earliest hominid ancestors to the present day. We'll move slowly through this vast expanse, pausing to imagine what life might have felt like, what challenges our ancestors faced, how they gradually became something new. And as we do, perhaps you'll find that the weight of all that time, the sheer patience of evolution, brings a sense of peace. Let us begin. To understand human evolution, we must first understand that for the vast majority of human prehistory, life was not remarkably different from the lives of other animals. Our ancestors were not aware they were becoming human. They did not know they were part of a grand story. They were simply living, hunting, gathering, raising their young, and struggling to survive in an ever-changing world. The rhythm of their existence was the rhythm of all creatures that have ever lived on this earth. Seek, eat, rest, reproduce, survive another day. Let us place ourselves in East Africa, approximately 6 to 7 million years ago. The landscape here would be strangely familiar, and yet deeply foreign to you. The climate was changing. Forests that once dominated the continent were slowly giving way to grasslands and savannas. This gradual transformation, this slow greening and then slow browning of the world, would prove to be one of the most important forces in our story. The world was becoming drier, and creatures that could adapt to this new dryness would flourish, while those that could not would fade away. Imagine yourself walking through this ancient landscape. The ground beneath your feet is golden grass, scattered with shrubs and the occasional cluster of trees. The air is warm and humid, thick with the scent of soil and vegetation, with an undertone of something else. The animal smell of the savanna, a musty richness that speaks of countless creatures moving through this space. In the distance you might hear the calls of birds, sharp and repetitive, and the rustling of unseen animals moving through the grass. Insects hum and buzz in the air. The sky above is immense, cloudless most days, stretching endlessly in shades of pale blue. This is not the Africa of today, but it is recognizable as Africa. It has the same vast openness, the same quality of light, the same sense of immense space and sparse habitation. In this landscape lived our earliest known hominid ancestors, creatures we might call proto-humans, though that term itself is imperfect. One of the most ancient of these was Sahelanthropus chidensis, a creature that walked upright on 2 legs but retained many ape-like characteristics. We know of this creature largely through a single skull, discovered in Chad, that is roughly 6 to 7 million years old. When scientists examine this skull, they see something that is neither fully ape nor fully human, but somewhere in between, a transitional form, a glimpse into what our deepest ancestry looked like. What would a day in the life of Sahelanthropus have looked like? We can only imagine, drawing on what we know of similar creatures and the environment in which they lived. Our ancestor would have woken with the light. There were no fires yet, no shelter beyond what the landscape provided, no sense of time beyond the immediate cycle of day and night. Perhaps they slept in trees, as modern apes do, seeking the safety that height provided from the predators that roamed the African savanna. The branches would have cradled their body, and they would have drifted in and out of sleep, always partially alert to danger, never fully surrendering to unconsciousness the way modern humans can. The dawn would have come gradually, cooling the air only slightly from the warmth of the night before, bringing with it the sounds of birds beginning their morning calls. Distant roars of big cats might have echoed across the landscape, the sounds of predators waking and beginning their own day's hunt. Our ancestor would have waited until the light was strong before descending, waiting until the nocturnal hunters had retreated to rest, and the diurnal predators had not yet become too active. Timing was everything when you had no weapons and no defenses beyond speed and cunning. Once on the ground, the day would have truly begun. The rhythm of their day would have been determined entirely by hunger and thirst, by the basic imperatives that govern all animal life. Our ancestor would have moved through the landscape with the casual purposefulness of an animal searching for food. Perhaps they traveled with a small group, a mother, siblings, a few others whose genetic proximity made them allies. Family bonds would have been strong, cemented by proximity and the shared struggle of survival. They moved on two legs, which was unusual for primates. This upright posture was not yet perfect. Their bodies would have been somewhat unstable by modern standards, with a center of gravity that required careful balance and deliberate movement. But over millions of years of ancestors, this walking upright had become increasingly efficient, and it offered advantages that would prove crucial to the future development of humanity. The advantages of bipedalism were multiple. Walking on two legs was actually more efficient for traveling long distances across open terrain than moving on four limbs. Your energy expenditure was lower. More importantly, it freed the hands. Hands that were not needed for walking could carry things, could gather food more effectively, could manipulate objects in ways that four-limbed creatures could not manage. And perhaps most importantly for the long arc of our story, it allowed for a different kind of visual perspective. Walking upright gave you a higher vantage point, allowed you to see farther across the grassland, to spot predators or prey or other groups of your kind before they could see you. This small advantage, repeated across millions of generations, would accumulate into something profound. The diet of these early hominids would have been mixed and seasonal, varying based on what the landscape offered at any given time. They likely ate fruits when they could find them, the seeds and flesh providing precious calories and nutrients, the sweetness a stark contrast to most of the other foods available. Wild figs, when in season, would have been a feast, and groups might have congregated around a productive fig tree, eating until their bellies were full and their faces were sticky with juice. They may have occasionally eaten insects, grubs, and small creatures they could catch with their hands, termites from their mounds, bees and their honey, small lizards or birds. They might have scavenged meat from kills made by larger predators, feasting quickly on the remnants before being driven away by the original hunters. The meat was precious, protein and fat rare and valuable nutrients that were harder to get from plants. The idea that they were mighty hunters is a romantic notion, but the reality was more humble and more precarious. They were small, relatively weak compared to the predators around them, and they ate what they could get, when they could get it. Water would have been a constant concern, a driving force in their daily movements. The savanna is not uniformly dry, but water sources, rivers, waterholes, seasonal pools, would have been scattered and unpredictable. Our ancestor would have known, through some innate or learned sense, where to find water. Perhaps they could smell it on the air from a great distance, or perhaps they simply knew the landscape as well as a modern human knows their hometown. having learned through generations of oral knowledge where water could be found in different seasons. When they found water, they would drink deeply, gorging themselves with it, as many animals do when water is not constantly available. They might also have used water sources as gathering points, knowing that other animals, both prey and predator, would also come to drink. Danger would follow the water, but so would opportunity. As midday approached, the heat would have become intense and nearly unbearable. The sun, directly overhead, would have bleached the color from the landscape, turning everything shades of gold and white and pale gray. The ground would have become too hot to walk on for extended periods, and the air would have shimmered with heat, creating mirages that played tricks on tired eyes. Our ancestor might have rested during these hottest hours, finding what shade could be found beneath a tree or in a shallow depression in the ground, or perhaps in a cave if one was nearby. They would have been vulnerable at this time, exposed and stationary, easy prey for any predator that happened to pass by. A lion, a saber-toothed cat, or one of the other megafaunas that roamed Africa would have seen them as a possible meal. Not the prime choice, perhaps, but not to be ignored either. A mother protecting her young would have been alert during this rest, listening and watching even as her body sought recovery from the heat and exertion of the morning. The afternoon hours would have been a time of waiting, a kind of suspension. There would have been little activity, little energy expended. Perhaps there would have been grooming, a social activity that served both hygienic and bonding purposes as it does in modern primates. One individual would pick through another's hair, removing parasites and dried skin, a rhythmic, repetitive action that was both functional and soothing. There would have been simple play, particularly among the younger members of the group, play that was also practice for the skills they would need to survive. Chasing games, wrestling, climbing competitions, all of these were ways of developing strength, speed, and confidence. There would have been conflict, too. Males would have competed for status and mating opportunities, their bodies tense with the assertion of dominance. Females would have managed their own social hierarchies, their own complex negotiations of power and alliance. The group would have had its tensions and its comforts, not so different from the social dynamics we see in modern primates, and not so different, perhaps, from the social dynamics we see in modern humans. As afternoon progressed and the light began to slant, the temperature would have dropped slightly, and activity would have increased again. There would have been foraging resumed, with more purpose than the morning search. Late afternoon was a time of gathering, a time to fill bellies before the onset of night. Any fruits or roots or insects that had been found would have been consumed. There would have been play and social interaction, grooming and the maintenance of social bonds, and always, underneath everything, a kind of vigilance, a watchfulness that never quite diminished. As evening approached, the landscape would have transformed in ways both dramatic and subtle. The temperature would have dropped, sometimes quite dramatically as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The colors would have deepened, golds becoming oranges, then deep reds, then purples as the sun descended. The quality of light would have changed, becoming both more beautiful and more eerie, creating shadows that were long and dark and full of hidden meaning. The sounds would have changed as well. The diurnal animals would have quieted, returning to nests or burrows or the safety of thick vegetation. The nocturnal creatures would have begun to stir, insects beginning their evening calls, distant sounds of nocturnal predators waking, the sounds of the night, insect calls, the distant roars of big cats, the huffing of hippos in rivers or waterholes, the howls of hyenas, would have grown louder and more numerous. Our ancestor would have felt the shift, would have sensed the change in the environment with an acuteness that we modern humans have largely lost. The body would have responded with a kind of natural anxiety, an alertness born of millions of years of evolution in environments where darkness meant danger. They would have sought shelter as darkness fell completely. Safety from predators was perhaps the most pressing concern of daily life, the thing that structured all other activities. Unlike modern humans, they had no fire, no tools for protection, no weapons beyond their own bodies and perhaps a good throwing arm. Their defense against the hunters of the night would have been to hide, to make themselves less visible and less vulnerable. Perhaps they would have climbed a tree, ascending to a height where large predators could not follow. The smaller branches would have held them, and they would have perched there, uncomfortable but safer than on the ground. Or perhaps they would have wedged themselves into a rocky crevice or sheltered under a fallen log, making themselves as small and inconspicuous as possible. They would have huddled together with their group, seeking comfort and warmth in numbers. There is something deeply primal about huddling together in the darkness, something that speaks to the fundamental, human need for group cohesion and protection. The body heat of multiple individuals would have made a difference in the cool of the African night, and the psychological comfort of being surrounded by others would have been significant. The night would have been long, and sleep would have been fitful, interrupted by sounds and movements, by the vigilance required to stay alive. They would have drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully surrendering to sleep, always ready to flee if danger approached. This rhythm would have repeated, day after day, season after season, year after year. There would have been variations, periods of plenty when fruits ripened in great abundance, or when a fresh kill from a lion or other predator could be scavenged, periods of scarcity when both plant and animal foods were hard to find, and hunger became a constant companion. There would have been births and deaths, the joy of a new offspring, and the grief of losing a group member to predation or disease. There would have been social dramas, conflicts and reconciliations, the formation of alliances and the breaking of them, the complex negotiations of social living. There would have been moments of peace and contentment, sitting in the sun, eating good food, surrounded by family. But the fundamental rhythm would have remained constant. Life was about finding food, finding water, avoiding predators and reproducing. There was no long-term planning, no sense of history, no ambition beyond the immediate needs of the day, no concept of a future beyond the next season. And yet, within this simple existence, something was slowly changing. The brains of these early hominids were larger than their ape cousins. The ratio of brain size to body size was increasing. They had the capacity, however limited, to remember, to learn from experience, to pass information to their offspring through teaching and example. They were beginning to use tools, at first, simply rocks that could be used to crack open bones to get at the marrow, or sticks that could be used to prod insects from their hiding places. These tools were crude by any standard, barely modified from their natural state, but they represented a new way of interacting with the world, a way of extending human capability beyond the limitations of the body alone. The hands of these early hominids were changing too, across generations and centuries and millennia. The bones were becoming more flexible, the grip more precise, the opposable thumb was becoming more developed and more refined. Generation after generation, subtle changes accumulated. Arms were becoming shorter relative to legs, the face was becoming flatter, less prognathic, with the nose moving more toward the center of the face. The teeth were becoming smaller and more suited to a varied diet. The jaws were becoming less powerful, less suited for grinding tough vegetation. These changes were happening so gradually that no individual would have noticed them. No parent would have seen a dramatic difference in their offspring compared to themselves. But across tens of thousands of generations, these subtle changes would accumulate into something quite different. We move forward now in time, not dramatically, but a steady step. We travel forward perhaps 1,000,000 years, though the landscape remains much the same. The African savanna, still golden and vast, still beautiful in its openness. But the creatures living in it have changed, evolved, adapted to the changing environment and to the changing demands of their own existence. Let us visit our next ancestors and imagine their lives. Around 5,000,000 years ago, creatures like Australopithecus afarensis walked the African savanna. They are perhaps the most famous of our early ancestors, known particularly through a skeleton called Lucy, discovered in Ethiopia in 1974. Lucy was small, perhaps 3.5 feet tall, weighing perhaps 65 pounds, and her brain was only slightly larger than that of a modern chimpanzee. But she walked upright, unmistakably bipedal, and there was something in the structure of her skeleton that speaks to an increasing sophistication, a movement towards something more human-like. Lucy lived in a landscape not dramatically different from that of Sahelanthropus, but the climate was continuing its slow change toward greater aridity. The forests were continuing to retreat, and the grasslands were continuing to expand. Australopithecus afarensis was well adapted to this landscape, more adapted than its earlier cousins. The bipedal stance was more efficient, more perfected. The hands, freed from the demands of walking, could do more work. The brain, though still small by modern standards, was larger and more complex. The daily life of Australopithecus would have been similar in many respects to what we've imagined for Sahelanthropus, but with subtle differences that speak to increasing sophistication. They were more efficient walkers now, more comfortable on two legs. This freed their hands for carrying. They could transport food, tools, or young over longer distances. They were increasingly able to move across diverse terrain, from the open grasslands to the remaining patches of forest, exploiting the resources of different environments in different seasons. The African climate was becoming increasingly variable, with periods of drought interspersed with periods of rainfall, and these creatures were becoming increasingly able to cope with this variability. They still ate a mixed diet, omnivorous in the truest sense. Analysis of their teeth and the wear patterns on them suggests they ate mostly plant material, seeds, roots, grasses, leaves, supplemented with small amounts of meat scavenged or occasionally hunted. They likely spent much of their day moving through the landscape, searching for food sources. When they found a productive area, they would have lingered, eating what was available, perhaps returning to the same location across multiple seasons if the resources were reliable. They would have known their territory, known where different foods could be found in different seasons, known how to move efficiently through the landscape to maximize caloric intake while minimizing energy expenditure. Socially, they likely lived in groups, as primates do. The structure of their skulls, and the degree of sexual dimorphism, the differences between males and females in size and robustness, suggest that male competition for mates was significant. The larger males would have dominated, controlling access to females and preferential feeding spots. They probably had hierarchies, with dominant males at the top and subordinate individuals arranged below them, each individual knowing their place in the social order. Females likely had their own hierarchies as well. These arrangements would have been maintained through a combination of physical displays, actual conflicts, and social cooperation. There would have been relationships, mothers deeply bonded with their offspring, the bond lasting many years as the young slowly matured and became independent. Siblings would have recognized each other, would have maintained connections that lasted into adulthood. Individuals would have had affinities and conflicts, friends and enemies, though these concepts would have been much simpler than the complex social emotions of modern humans. Their tool use was advancing. They were using stones and sticks in increasingly purposeful ways. They were beginning to deliberately modify stones, striking them carefully to create sharp edges that could be used for cutting. These early stone tools, called the Oldowan toolkit, represented a significant cognitive advance, even if we might look at them today and see only crude rocks. The ability to plan ahead, to imagine what a tool might do before making it, to execute that plan successfully. These were new capabilities, however primitive. The act of tool-making required an understanding of cause and effect, a kind of intentionality that had not previously existed in the hominid lineage. The daily pattern would still have been much the same as before, searching for food, eating, resting, socializing, seeking shelter as night fell. The needs were unchanged, but their days were becoming longer in a sense. With better tools, they could access food sources that less sophisticated creatures could not. They could crack open bones that would otherwise be inedible, accessing the rich marrow inside. They could cut through tough hides more effectively, processing meat more efficiently. They could travel farther, adapt to new environments more readily, and most importantly, their brains were slowly getting larger, their cognitive abilities slowly increasing. And here, in this slow accumulation of change, in this patient adaptation to a changing world, we see the shape of the future beginning to emerge. We see the ancestors of beings who would one day paint on cave walls, who would ask questions about the stars, who would write down their thoughts and pass them to future generations. But all of that is still in the future, the distant future. For now, these creatures are simply living their lives in Africa, under the sun, in the rhythm of days and seasons, unaware that they are part of a great unfolding story of change and adaptation that would one day lead to beings like us. As we continue our journey through the vast expanse of deep time, we find ourselves crossing a threshold, not a sudden crossing, but a gradual one, a slow transition from one kind of creature to another. We have traveled forward another 1,000,000 years or so, and now we arrive at a period of remarkable change. Around 2.5 to 3 million years ago, a new creature appeared in the fossil record. Scientists would call it Homo habilis, the handy man, so named for its increasingly sophisticated use of tools. To understand human evolution is to understand this creature, because in many ways, Homo habilis marks the beginning of the human story, even though there would be many more chapters, many more transformations, before anything recognizable as modern humanity would emerge. The landscape is still Africa, still the savanna, but the world has continued to change. The climate has become more variable, more unpredictable. Droughts are more frequent and more severe. The grasslands have expanded further. Forests have retreated to scattered refugia in wetter areas. It is a harder world in many respects, a world that demands more of its inhabitants, a world that selects for innovation and adaptability. Into this world stepped Homo habilis. Homo habilis was larger than Australopithecus, with a brain that was noticeably bigger. Where Australopithecus had a brain of perhaps 400 to 500 cubic centimeters, Homo habilis had a brain of perhaps 600 to 700 cubic centimeters, still small by modern standards but larger, with more surface area, more folds and complexity. The body was more fully bipedal, the gait more efficient, the hands were more sophisticated, with opposable thumbs and fingers that could perform more delicate and complex tasks. Looking at Homo habilis, we see something that is unmistakably becoming human, even if it would be millions of years before anything resembling modern humans appeared. And yet, in many ways, the daily life of Homo habilis would still have been recognizable from our earlier descriptions. They still lived in groups, still hunted and gathered, still moved through the landscape searching for food and water. They still feared predators, still needed shelter and safety, but there was something new as well, something that would slowly reshape the world and ultimately lead to beings like us. Let us imagine a day in the life of Homo habilis, perhaps 2.5 million years ago, in what is now Tanzania or Kenya or Ethiopia. The individual we will follow is a young male, not yet fully grown, but old enough to be learning the skills that will allow him to survive and eventually reproduce. Let us call him, for the sake of convenience, Kavi, though of course, these early humans had no names, or if they did, we have no record of them. Kavi woke before dawn, as was the habit of his kind. Sleep was never deep, never fully surrendering. The slightest sound would have brought him partially awake, his primitive limbic system assessing threat, his muscles ready to move. But the night had passed without incident. No prowling predators had come near. No lions or hyenas had threatened the group. As the first light began to touch the eastern sky, Kavi rose, stretching muscles that were still sore from yesterday's exertions. The group had sheltered that night in a rocky outcropping, a place they had used many times before. The stones provided protection on 3 sides, and the open side faced toward a clear area where approaching predators could be seen from a distance. As Kavi moved out of the shelter, he could see the landscape beginning to take form in the pre-dawn light. The grass, tall and dry from the recent drought, was turning from black to gray to golden as the light increased. The few acacia trees that dotted the landscape were becoming visible, their distinctive umbrella shapes silhouetted against the brightening sky. In the distance, smoke rose from a volcanic cone, a reminder that this landscape was geologically active, unstable in ways that the humans of this time could not have understood. Kavi's mother was already awake, sitting on a rock and grooming her own hair, looking out across the landscape. Grooming was more than a hygienic necessity, it was a social activity, a way of maintaining bonds and establishing hierarchy. His younger sister was still sleeping, huddled against his mother's side, wrapped in her warmth. His father, or the male who had mated with his mother and claimed him as part of his group, was absent. He had gone out with several other males before dark the previous evening, searching for the carcass of a large animal that they had scavenged from several days before. Sometimes carrion could be preserved, the body of a dead animal lasting several days before becoming too putrid to eat. As the sun rose, the group became active. There were perhaps 15 or 20 individuals in this particular group, a mix of males and females, young and old, all bound together by kinship and habit, and the simple fact that group living was safer than solitary living. The dominant males would have had preferential access to food and to mating, but there was a kind of cooperation that held the group together. They hunted together, shared food, raised young communally, protected each other from predators. Kavi's first task of the day was to find food. The hunger that woke him, the constant, never quite satisfied hunger of an active young animal, drove him forward. He moved with his mother and several other females and young males, traveling out into the grassland in search of plant foods. They moved slowly, stopping frequently to examine the ground, to look under rocks and fallen logs, to dig at the base of plants that might have edible tubers or roots. The diet of Homo habilis was still primarily plant-based, with meat being a supplement when it could be obtained. Kavi and the others searched for fruits, seeds, nuts, and roots. They turned over rocks and logs looking for insects. Termites were a particular prize, protein-rich and relatively easy to extract. They knew the landscape intimately, knew which plants bore fruit in which seasons, knew where water could be found even in the driest times. This knowledge was passed from mother to young, from experienced individuals to those learning, accumulated across generations. After several hours of searching, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, Kavi's group found a dried riverbed where recent rains had exposed some roots. These roots were tough and bitter, not particularly appealing, but they contained calories and nutrients were always precious. The group dug at the roots with sticks and with their hands, working the earth loose, extracting what they could. Kavi's hands were becoming sore from the work, the skin worn and raw, but he continued. Discomfort was simply part of existence. You worked until you had enough food, or until it was too dark to continue, and then you rested. But Kavi had another task as well, a task that was becoming increasingly important in the world of Homo habilis. As he traveled through the landscape with his group, he was looking for something specific: stones. Not just any stones, but particular kinds of stones, stones with the right properties. He needed stone that was hard but not too brittle, stone that could be shaped and modified. Kavi had learned tool-making from observing older males, learning by watching and imitating, learning by trial and error. The technique was simple, at least in concept. You took a stone, a river rock, a piece of volcanic rock, and you struck it with another stone. If you struck it in the right place with the right force, a flake would come off, leaving a sharp edge. This sharp edge could be used for cutting, for scraping, for processing food in ways that were previously impossible. As the group rested during the hottest part of the afternoon, Kavi collected several stones. He found a piece of quartz and a piece of basalt, both good raw materials. He found a rounded river stone that would work as a hammer. Then he began his work. Striking the first stone with the hammer stone, Kavi produced a sharp flake. It was not perfect. The edge was uneven, the flake was irregular, but it was sharp. He ran his thumb along the edge carefully, feeling for the sharpest point. Then he worked to refine it, making a few more strikes, removing some of the sharper points that might be too fragile. This was the craft of tool-making, the beginning of technology. It required hand-eye coordination, strength, and planning. It required the ability to imagine what you wanted to create before you created it. When Kavi was satisfied with his tool, he tested it. He found a piece of meat, part of a small animal that had been killed and partially eaten days before, the remaining portion cached in a sheltered spot. The tool cut through the tough skin easily, revealing the decaying flesh beneath. The flake was useful, functional, an extension of his hand that allowed him to do things he could not do without it. Tool-making was not invented by Homo habilis. Australopithecus had used crude tools, striking stones to produce sharp flakes. But Homo habilis was more intentional about it, more systematic, more willing to invest time in producing good tools. The old Dewan toolkit, named for the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where these tools were first identified, was becoming increasingly refined and standardized. Tools were being made with a purpose, with an understanding of what they would be used for. This represented a cognitive shift, a new kind of thinking. As afternoon faded into evening, the group began to move back toward their sheltered campsite. The shelter was important. It provided protection from predators and from the elements. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, the group huddled together, sharing warmth. Kavi curled up next to his mother, his younger sister on his other side. The males of the group, including the dominant ones, positioned themselves around the perimeter, their larger bodies providing a kind of protective barrier. The night was long, as nights always were. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by sounds and movements, never fully deep. Around midnight, a hyena pack passed near the shelter, their laughter-like calls echoing across the landscape. The humans huddled together, silent and still, hoping to appear less appealing as prey than whatever else the hyenas might find. The pack eventually moved on, but sleep did not return easily. This was life for Homo habilis, a constant balancing act between hunger and danger, between the need to find food and the need to avoid becoming food. There was no security, no sense that tomorrow would be better or different. There were only the rhythm of days and nights, the search for sustenance, the maintenance of social bonds, the endless vigilance against threats. But within this harsh existence, something remarkable was happening. The brains of Homo habilis were getting larger, the tools were getting more sophisticated, the group structures were becoming more complex, knowledge was being accumulated and transmitted. The capacity for innovation, for trying new things and learning from the results, was increasing. Let us move forward again, forward in time, perhaps 500,000 years. The creatures we encounter now are becoming even more recognizably human. We are approaching the era of Homo erectus creatures, whose brain size would increase further, whose tools would become more sophisticated, whose ability to control and use fire would mark a turning point in human evolution. But before we reach that point, let us linger a bit longer in the world of Homo habilis and the early stages of the human journey, because it is here, in these early toolmakers, that we see the spark that would become human civilization. It is here that we see the beginning of intentionality, of planning, of the accumulation of knowledge. It is here that we see creatures beginning to shape their world, rather than simply accepting it. One significant aspect of life for Homo habilis that we should consider is scavenging, not the opportunistic scavenging of Australopithecus, but a more organized approach to finding and processing meat. The African savanna of 2.5 million years ago was populated with megafauna, large predators and large prey animals. Lions, saber-toothed cats, hyenas and wild dogs made kills regularly. When a large animal was killed, there was more meat than the predators could eat in a single feeding. Homo habilis, watching from a distance, would have understood this. They would have learned to follow vultures and other scavengers, knowing that large congregations of scavengers indicated a fresh kill. They would have learned to approach when the major predators were resting, to quickly harvest what meat they could before being driven away. This scavenging was dangerous and required courage, but it provided access to meat, the most valuable nutritional resource available. Meat contains protein and fat, both essential for building and maintaining the larger brains that Homo habilis was developing. The calories available from meat were far greater than those available from plant foods, calorie for calorie. By incorporating more meat into their diet, Homo habilis was able to feed larger brains. This created a positive feedback loop. Larger brains allowed for better planning and better tool making, which led to more successful scavenging and hunting, which provided more meat, which allowed for even larger brains. This relationship between diet, brain size, and tool use is one of the most important themes in human evolution. It is not entirely clear what caused what, whether better tools led to more meat consumption leading to larger brains, or whether selection for larger brains, for some other reason, led to tool use and meat consumption. Most likely, all of these factors were interrelated, each reinforcing the others. The control of fire, which we mentioned briefly when looking forward toward Homo erectus, would eventually become another crucial factor in this feedback loop. Fire would allow meat to be cooked, making it easier to digest and extracting more nutrients from it. Fire would also allow for the processing of plant foods that were otherwise inedible. Fire would provide warmth and protection from predators. But these advances were still in the future. For now, Homo habilis ate raw meat, extracting what nutrition they could, using their sophisticated tools to process the food as effectively as possible. The social structures of Homo habilis were also becoming more complex. Evidence from fossils and from archaeological sites suggests that these creatures were beginning to specialize in their roles. Larger males may have focused on hunting and scavenging, traveling long distances and taking physical risks. Females and smaller males may have focused more on gathering plant foods, which were more predictable and required less travel. This division of labor, if it existed, would have been a significant development, allowing the group to be more efficient in its gathering and hunting. Pair bonding may also have been developing during this period. In modern chimpanzees and gorillas, sexual relationships are relatively brief and transactional. A female comes into estrus, males compete for access, mating occurs, and then the relationship ends. But there is evidence that in early human ancestors, something different was happening. Females may have begun to hide their fertility signs, making it harder for males to know when they were fertile. This would have encouraged males to stay near particular females consistently, to share in the care and feeding of potential offspring, to develop longer-term partnerships. This pair bonding would have had significant implications for social structure, for the way groups were organized, and for the way young were raised. The raising of young was becoming more extended in Homo habilis. Young individuals required longer periods of dependency and learning. A child of Homo erectus, which would come later, took perhaps 12 to 14 years to reach full maturity, much longer than in modern chimpanzees. This extended childhood allowed for more learning, more transmission of knowledge from one generation to the next. But it also required significant investment from parents, particularly from mothers. Pair bonding and the cooperation of mates in raising offspring would have become increasingly important. Language, or at least the beginnings of language, may have been developing during the Homo habilis period. Modern humans are the only creatures with true, full language, a complex system of symbols that can represent abstract concepts and that allows for the discussion of past and future. But the roots of language may go back much further. Early hominids certainly had vocalizations, warnings about predators, calls to maintain group cohesion, expressions of emotion. As brains got larger and more complex, as the ability to plan and to imagine increased, the capacity for more complex vocalizations would have developed. By the time of Homo habilis, there may have been something approaching primitive language, not the sophisticated language of modern humans, but something more than the simple vocalizations of modern apes. We cannot know for certain. Soft tissues, the larynx, the tongue, the structures that produce sound, do not fossilize. We can make educated guesses based on the size and shape of skulls, based on comparative anatomy with modern animals, based on the archaeological evidence of tool use and social organization. But these are guesses, and we should acknowledge the limits of our knowledge. What we can say is that the capacity for something approaching language was increasing, and this capacity would have facilitated the transmission of knowledge and the coordination of complex activities. The world in which Homo habilis lived was changing. The climate was oscillating, with periods of greater rainfall alternating with periods of severe drought. These environmental fluctuations would have created selection pressure for adaptability, for the ability to switch between different food sources, for innovation in the face of changing conditions. The creatures that could plan, could make tools, could organize complex group activities, and could pass knowledge to the next generation would have been more likely to survive these fluctuations and to pass on their genes. By the end of the Homo habilis period, roughly 2 million years ago, the stage was set for the next major development in human evolution. Homo erectus would emerge, with a brain that was even larger, with tools that were even more sophisticated, with the ability to control and use fire. The transformation that had begun with upright walking would accelerate. The path that would eventually lead to modern humans was becoming clearer, though none of the creatures living through this transition could have understood what was coming. The story of Homo habilis is ultimately a story of innovation, adaptation, and the slow accumulation of knowledge. These early toolmakers were not thinking about the future of humanity. They were simply trying to live, to feed themselves and their young, to find safety and comfort in a harsh. But in doing so, in developing their tools and their social structures, in beginning to shape their world rather than simply accepting it, they were setting humanity on a path that would lead, millions of years later, to you, lying in bed, listening to the story of your deep ancestors, contemplating the vast span of time that connects you to them. As we journey further through the vast landscape of human prehistory, we encounter questions that fascinate us precisely because they cannot be fully answered. We find ourselves in the realm of archaeological mystery, where we must piece together the lives of our ancestors from fragmentary evidence. A bone here, a stone tool there, the ash from an ancient fire. These puzzles, these incomplete glimpses into deep time, have their own beauty, their own contemplative quality. They invite us to wonder, to imagine, to think carefully about what it means to be human and how we came to be the way we are. Let us return to the period of Homo erectus, a species that would dominate the African landscape and eventually spread beyond it for nearly 2 million years. Homo erectus emerged roughly 1.8 to 2 million years ago, and the species would persist until perhaps 100,000 years ago in some locations. This was a creature of remarkable longevity in evolutionary terms, a species that remained largely stable for an extraordinarily long time, even as the world around it changed dramatically. Homo erectus was notably larger than Homo habilis. An adult male could reach 5.5 to 6 feet in height, with a brain size of 800 to 1100 cubic centimeters. The body was fully bipedal, the skeleton modern in its overall proportions. Looking at a skeleton of Homo erectus, you would see something that, from the neck down, might not look dramatically different from a modern human. It is in the skull that the differences become apparent: the larger jaw, the pronounced brow ridge, the shape of the brain case. But the basic body plan is recognizably human. One of the great mysteries of Homo erectus is the remarkable stability of the species. From Africa to Europe to Asia, Homo erectus populations maintain similar body forms, similar tool technologies, similar behaviors for nearly 2 million years. This is extraordinary by modern standards, where we have seen dramatic changes in human culture and appearance in the mere 10,000 years since agriculture was invented. What does this tell us about the pace of change? What does it suggest about the intellectual capabilities of these creatures? Did they lack the capacity for innovation? Or did they live in such stable environments? Or did their toolkits and behaviors work so well that change was simply not selected for? The emergence of fire use is one of the most significant mysteries, and one of the most important developments in human history. We have evidence that Homo erectus used fire. There are ancient hearths, layers of ash and burnt bone in archaeological sites. But when did fire use begin? How did it begin? We do not know. The earliest potential evidence for the controlled use of fire comes from sites in Africa dating to perhaps 1.5 million years ago. Though the evidence is ambiguous, it is not clear whether humans were deliberately making fire through the striking of stones or the friction of wood, or whether they were simply capturing fire from natural sources, lightning strikes, volcanic activity, and maintaining it, protecting it, and using it for their purposes. The control of fire would have been transformative in ways both practical and psychological. Fire provides warmth, extending the range of habitats that could be occupied. Early humans could now survive in colder climates, could venture farther north into Europe and Asia. Fire provides light, extending the active hours of the day and reducing the dangers of darkness. Where previously humans had been forced to shelter as night fell, the presence of fire meant that activities could continue into the evening hours. Fire can be used to cook meat, making it more digestible and releasing more nutrients. The heat breaks down collagen and makes proteins more accessible. Fire can be used to cook plant foods, making some foods that would otherwise be inedible become edible, or at least more palatable. Toxic plants could be processed through heating to remove their poisons. Fire can be used to process hides and other materials, to harden wooden tools, to shape bone and antler. And fire provides a gathering point, a focal point for social interaction, a place where groups can congregate, where social bonds can be maintained and strengthened, where stories can be told and knowledge transmitted. But here is the mystery. We do not see dramatic changes in the archaeological record that correspond to the adoption of fire. Tool technologies do not suddenly become more sophisticated. Body size does not suddenly increase. Brain size does not suddenly jump. This suggests that the adoption of fire, whenever it occurred, was gradual. Perhaps it was first used rarely, then more frequently, its advantages slowly becoming apparent, the technology of fire keeping slowly becoming more reliable and more widely known. Or perhaps fire was used in a limited way, only in certain locations, only in certain seasons, only by certain groups, before its use became more widespread and more reliable. The tools of Homo erectus, particularly the hand axes that are characteristic of the Acheulean toolkit, named for the site of Saint-Acheulean in France, where many such tools were found, present another fascinating puzzle. These hand axes are distinctive objects, symmetrical, carefully shaped, often remarkably beautiful in their proportions. They appear to have been used for various purposes: cutting meat, processing hides, digging for roots and tubers. But why did Homo erectus invest so much effort in making them symmetrical? Why did they care about the aesthetic properties of their tools? Why did they not simply make crude implements that would have served the same practical purposes? This is a genuine mystery that has occupied the minds of archaeologists and anthropologists for decades. One possibility is that symmetry was simply the result of the most efficient manufacturing process, that the most economical way to make a hand axe happened to produce symmetrical objects. The symmetry could be a byproduct of efficient knapping technique, rather than an intentional goal. Another possibility is that symmetry was selected for because it indicated skill, because better-made tools were more reliable and more effective, and because individuals who could make better tools had higher status and reproductive success. But a third possibility is that symmetry mattered for reasons that had nothing to do with function, that Homo erectus was beginning to care about aesthetics, about making things beautiful as well as functional, that they were beginning to engage in what we might call art or craft for its own sake. If this last possibility is true, it represents a significant cognitive development. It suggests that Homo erectus was beginning to engage in behavior that had no immediate survival value, that was done for reasons that were psychological or social, rather than purely practical. This would be one of the first hints of culture, of behavior that is passed on socially rather than genetically, that exists primarily to serve social or psychological purposes rather than practical ones. It would be the first evidence of what we might call the human impulse toward beauty and self-expression. The question of language in Homo erectus remains deeply mysterious and much debated among scholars. The size of the Broca's area, the region of the brain associated with language production, does not appear to be significantly enlarged in Homo erectus skulls compared to earlier hominids. The structure of the larynx, insofar as we can tell from skeletal remains, does not appear to be fully adapted for the full range of sounds that modern humans can produce. And yet, we have evidence of complex social organization, evidence of the control of fire, evidence of tool use that suggests planning and intentionality. How could all of this be managed without language? Modern humans cannot imagine thinking without language. Our thoughts are structured by language. We organize our knowledge, our memories, our plans into linguistic form. We use language to communicate with others, to share abstract ideas, to discuss things that are not immediately present. But it is possible that Homo erectus, much like modern apes, had rich emotional and social lives without true language in the modern sense. They may have had complex vocalizations, different calls for different situations, expressing different emotions and warnings. They may have had sophisticated gestures and body language. They may have had sophisticated facial expressions and other non-verbal forms of communication that conveyed meaning without being language in the modern, grammatical sense. They may have learned by watching and imitating, by trial and error, by the gradual accumulation of knowledge across generations, passed down through demonstration and practice, rather than through verbal instruction. The absence of language, if that is indeed what they lacked, would have made certain things impossible. The discussion of abstract concepts would have been difficult or impossible. The detailed planning of future activities would have been limited. The transmission of complex technical knowledge across generations would have been slower and less reliable, but it would not have made complex social organization impossible. We see in modern apes, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, complex social organization, social hierarchies, long-term relationships, and even rudimentary culture, without anything approaching true language. Homo erectus, with a larger brain than any modern ape, could certainly have achieved similar or greater complexity of social organization without true language. The dispersal of Homo erectus out of Africa presents another fascinating mystery. Around 1.8 to 2 million years ago, populations of Homo erectus began to migrate out of Africa, eventually reaching as far as Java in Southeast Asia, and as far north as the Caucasus, and eventually into Europe. This was the first major expansion of the human family beyond the African continent. But how did this happen? Did populations gradually expand their ranges, with each generation moving slightly farther afield, slowly pushing the boundaries of the species' range? Did some kind of exploration or exploratory drive motivate the movement? Were some groups intentionally seeking new lands, or were they simply following migrating animals or responding to climate changes that pushed them into new territories? We have no way of knowing. The archaeological record cannot tell us the motivations, the experiences, the thoughts of these ancient peoples. We can say that by 1.8 million years ago, humans had reached the Caucasus. By perhaps 1.5 million years ago, they had reached Java. By perhaps 500,000 years ago, they had reached Europe. This expansion would have required the crossing of vast distances, the adaptation to new environments with different climates, different prey animals, different plant resources. It would have required the discovery of water sources, the learning of new landscapes, the adaptation of toolkits and behaviors to new conditions. The fact that this was accomplished suggests a level of adaptability and intelligence, but also perhaps a willingness to take risks, to venture into the unknown. We do know that Homo erectus populations in Java, often classified as a separate species by some researchers, Homo soloensis, or Homo floresiensis in some cases, though this taxonomy is much debated, persisted until relatively recently, perhaps 100,000 years ago, or even later in some locations. These populations were geographically isolated from African populations for hundreds of thousands of years, yet they maintained roughly the same basic body form and tool technology as African populations. This speaks to the remarkable stability of the species, but it also raises questions. How did populations isolated from each other maintain such similarity? Did they share some kind of common cultural template that was transmitted across generations and across vast distances? Or was this similarity simply the result of shared ancestry and the constraints of natural selection in different but environmentally similar locations? One of the most intriguing archaeological mysteries comes from sites in Africa and Europe dating to the Middle Pleistocene, the period roughly 1 million to 100,000 years ago. At sites like Ambrona in Spain and Bilzingsleben in Germany, we find evidence that Homo erectus had constructed shelters, had made arrangements of stones and bones that suggest intentional organization of space. At Ambrona, archaeologists have found what appears to be a deliberately constructed camp, with different areas apparently used for different purposes, perhaps separate areas for butchering meat, for processing stone tools, for sleeping. The presence of large quantities of butchered elephant remains suggests that these creatures were engaged in sophisticated hunting, perhaps even driving large animals toward particular locations where they could be killed more easily. But here is the mystery: the evidence is ambiguous. We cannot be entirely certain that these arrangements were intentional. Perhaps the stones and bones were arranged as a result of natural processes, the movement of water or the actions of scavengers. Perhaps what we interpret as a camp was simply a location where kills had been made and processed, with the arrangement of remains being a coincidental result of how the work was done. the natural consequence of butchering activities rather than deliberate. Camp construction. Archaeologists constantly grapple with this problem, the difficulty of distinguishing intentional human behavior from accidental patterns created by natural processes. It is a humbling reminder of how much interpretation is required in archaeology, how much of what we think we know about the past is actually inference and educated guessing rather than certain knowledge. The question of hunting versus scavenging in Homo erectus also remains mysterious and much debated among specialists. Earlier hominids we have discussed were primarily scavengers, eating meat from kills made by other predators. But Homo erectus, with its larger body, its increased strength, its sophisticated tools, may have been increasingly capable of hunting large animals actively. The presence of stone tools and butchered remains of large animals at sites is suggestive of hunting, but it is difficult to prove definitively. Did Homo erectus actively hunt large animals like elephants and hippopotami, or were these sites locations where scavenged carcasses were processed? Or was it a mix of both, with hunting becoming increasingly important over time? Or did different populations in different locations rely more or less on hunting versus scavenging? The answer to this question likely varies by location and by time period. Some Homo erectus populations may have been more successful at hunting than others. Some may have relied more on scavenging. The climate and the available prey species would have varied across the vast geographic range of the species. Some areas would have had abundant large game animals, others would have had less predictable resources. What we can say is that by the time of Homo erectus, our ancestors were increasingly engaged with large animals, increasingly able to exploit meat sources that smaller, less sophisticated creatures could not access. This shift toward meat consumption, toward hunting or intensive scavenging of large animals, may have been crucial in supporting the larger brains and bodies of Homo erectus. Let us now shift our focus to a later period, to the time of Homo neanderthalensis and early Homo sapiens, roughly 300,000 to 30,000 years ago. In the fossil record and in the archaeological evidence, we begin to see behaviors that are unmistakably cultural, behaviors that speak to a level of sophistication and symbolic thinking that had not been clearly present before. One of the most striking pieces of evidence for symbolic or cultural behavior in Neanderthals comes from burial sites. In several locations in Europe and the Middle East, Neanderthal skeletons have been found in what appear to be intentional burials. At La Chapelle-aux-Saints, in France, a Neanderthal skeleton was found lying carefully on its back in what appeared to be a grave. At Shanidar in Iraq, a Neanderthal individual was found in a grave, and pollen analysis of the surrounding soil revealed the presence of pollen from flowers, leading some researchers to suggest that the body had been deliberately covered with flowers as part of a burial ritual. These burials are significant because they suggest that Neanderthals cared for their dead, that they treated death as something that required special treatment different from the treatment of the bodies of other animals. The deliberate placement of the body, the care taken in arranging it, the possible inclusion of flowers or other grave goods, all of these suggest that Neanderthals may have held beliefs about the significance of death and what happened after death. But again, there is mystery and ambiguity. Not all researchers agree that all supposed Neanderthal burials were truly intentional. Some of the evidence is ambiguous. The presence of pollen at Shanidar, for instance, could potentially be explained by natural processes, by the burrowing of animals or the growth of plant roots after the individual had been buried. But the weight of evidence suggests that at least some Neanderthal burials were intentional, and this is significant. Intentional burial suggests a level of symbolic thought, a recognition that the dead individual was significant enough to warrant special treatment, perhaps a belief that the individual had some kind of continued existence or importance after death. Another fascinating mystery concerns Neanderthal art and symbolism. There is evidence that Neanderthals used pigments, ochre in particular, a natural iron oxide that could be red, yellow, or brown depending on its precise composition. Ochre has been found at Neanderthal sites, and there is evidence that Neanderthals collected it and transported it, suggesting that it was valued for some reason. But whether Neanderthals used ochre for decoration of the body, for symbolic purposes, or for practical purposes such as treating hides to make them more supple and waterproof is unclear. There is some evidence of carved objects, items that appear to have been deliberately shaped by Neanderthal hands, but whether these were purely aesthetic, or whether they had other meanings is unclear. Neanderthals appear not to have engaged in the sophisticated cave painting and elaborate symbolic behaviors that early modern humans would eventually develop. The famous cave paintings of Europe, the paintings in Chaucer, Lascaux, Altamira, and many others, appear to have been made by early modern humans rather than by Neanderthals, who had largely disappeared from Europe by the time these paintings were being made. But the question of whether this was a difference in cognitive capability or simply a difference in culture and preference remains debated. Did Neanderthals lack the cognitive capacity for visual art, or did they simply have different cultural practices and different ways of expressing their symbolic thinking? What we can say with some confidence is that Neanderthals had complex behaviors, complex social structures, and some evidence of symbolic or culturally meaningful behavior. They were not the primitive brutes, the slow-witted cavemen, that they were often portrayed as in popular culture. They had sophisticated stone tools. They could hunt large game effectively. They cared for their sick and injured members of their group. They had some awareness of death and possibly some beliefs about what happened after death. They were sophisticated creatures living in a sophisticated society, even if their level of symbolic thinking and cultural elaboration was apparently not as developed as that of early modern humans. The emergence of early modern humans, Homo sapiens, is itself surrounded by mystery. Anatomically modern humans, humans with the physical characteristics of modern humans, appear in the fossil record in Africa around 200,000 years ago. But behaviorally modern humans, humans capable of the full range of modern cognitive behaviors, including language, art, and complex symbolic thinking, do not appear until much later, around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. This gap between anatomical modernity and behavioral modernity is one of the most intriguing puzzles in human evolution. What happened during those 100,000 years or more? Why did behavior change so dramatically? Some researchers have suggested that there was a genetic mutation around 50,000 years ago that suddenly granted humans the capacity for language and symbolic thinking. But other researchers argue that anatomically modern humans always had these capacities, and that the changes we see in the archaeological record reflect changes in how these capacities were expressed, or changes in population sizes and social structures that made complex behaviors more advantageous. The Great Leap Forward, as some researchers have called the emergence of behavioral modernity, is marked in the archaeological record by a sudden appearance of art, of complex tools, of evidence of long-distance trade, of elaborate burial practices. In Europe, this corresponds roughly with the arrival of modern humans from Africa, around 40,000 years ago. In Africa, some evidence of symbolic behavior appears earlier, around 70,000 to 100,000 years ago. This suggests that behavioral modernity may have emerged gradually, in different places at different times, as populations developed the social structures and perhaps the linguistic capabilities that would allow for the expression of these modern behaviors. One of the most evocative pieces of evidence for the emergence of behavioral modernity comes from burial sites. At sites like Sungur in Russia, dating to around 24,000 years ago, we find burials that are remarkably elaborate. Bodies are covered in carefully placed beads, some burials containing thousands of beads arranged in patterns that suggest considerable effort in the arrangement. The individuals buried are sometimes children, suggesting that parents were willing to invest enormous effort in burying their young with great care and elaborate decoration. This speaks to beliefs about death and the afterlife, to the symbolic significance of the individual, to the importance of ritual in marking significant life events. It speaks to love, to grief, to the human need to honor the dead and to mark their passing with ceremony and care. But here is another mystery. We do not know what these elaborate burials meant. We do not know what the beads symbolized, whether they had meanings that varied by color or arrangement, whether they represented status or wealth or religious beliefs. We can infer that death was significant, that the deceased was considered important enough to warrant elaborate treatment, that ritual and ceremony played a role in the handling of the dead. But the specific meanings, the specific beliefs, the specific emotions involved in these burials are lost to us, separated from us by thousands of years, and the absence of any written records or verbal testimony. The emergence of art in the archaeological record is another fascinating mystery. Around 40,000 years ago, we begin to see evidence of sophisticated art, carved figurines, painted caves, decorated tools. The Venus figurines, small carved female figures found scattered across Europe, dating to around 25,000 years ago, are particularly intriguing. These figures are typically made from stone, bone, or ivory, carved with remarkable skill. They are characterized by exaggerated breasts and hips, often with featureless heads and feet. What do these figurines represent? Are they fertility symbols, depictions of pregnant women, representations of female sexuality or female power? Are they representations of actual women, individual portraits, or idealized forms? Are they representations of goddesses? Do they represent an early form of abstract art? Were they used in rituals, carried as amulets, or displayed for some other purpose? We do not know. The figurines themselves can be described in objective terms. They have exaggerated breasts and hips. They are carved with remarkable skill from stone or ivory. They appear to have been highly valued, as some were transported long distances from their place of manufacture. But their meaning, their purpose, their significance in the lives of the people who made them remain enigmatic. We can speculate, we can offer theories, but we cannot know with certainty. And that uncertainty is part of the fascination, the thought that these figures meant something profound to the people who made them, something so important that they invested significant time and effort in creating them, and yet we cannot access that meaning across the gulf of time. Cave paintings present similar mysteries. The caves of Chaucer, Lascaux, Altamira, and many others contain remarkably sophisticated paintings of animals, horses, bison, deer, and other creatures. These paintings are often found deep within caves, in areas that would have been completely dark without artificial light, and that would have been difficult to access, requiring the climber to squeeze through narrow passages and navigate treacherous terrain. This suggests that the paintings had significance beyond simple decoration of living spaces, beyond marking one's territory or creating art for its own sake. Were they created as part of religious rituals? Did they represent magic, attempts to influence hunts through sympathetic magic, the idea that painting an animal and ritually hunting it in the painting would influence the success of the actual hunt? Were they expressions of spiritual or religious beliefs? Were they simply art, created for the sake of beauty and self-expression and aesthetic pleasure? Were they a form of communication between groups, a way of marking territory or conveying information? We can see that the artists had remarkable skill, that they had a sophisticated understanding of perspective and animal anatomy, that they cared deeply about their work. But the meanings behind these works, the thoughts and feelings of the artists who created them, are lost to us. Music and dance likely played a role in the lives of early modern humans, but we have almost no direct evidence of them. Musical instruments, flutes, made from bone or ivory, appear in the archaeological record around 40,000 years ago, suggesting that music was important, that people valued music enough to spend the time and effort required to make musical instruments. But what kinds of music did they make? What purposes did music serve? Did it have religious or ceremonial significance? Was it entertainment? Was it a way of communicating emotion? Were there different types of music for different occasions? We can only guess based on what we see in modern human cultures. In virtually all modern human societies, music plays an important role. It is used in rituals, in celebrations, in mourning. It is used to express emotion, to coordinate group activity, to pass on history and knowledge. We might reasonably assume that music played similar roles in the lives of early modern humans, but we cannot know. The emergence of language remains one of the greatest mysteries. We have no direct evidence of language in ancient humans. We cannot hear the voices of our ancestors. We cannot know what languages they spoke, what sounds they made, what concepts they could express. But the emergence of complex toolkits, of art, of trade networks spanning hundreds of kilometers, of elaborate social organization, All of these suggest that language, or something very much like modern language, had emerged by the time of early modern humans. Comparative linguistics suggests that all modern human languages are related, descended from a common ancestor, and that this common ancestor language existed perhaps 50,000 to 100,000 years ago. But we cannot know for certain. We cannot know what this ancestral language sounded like, what concepts it could express, how it differed from or was similar to modern languages. The origins of language are lost to us in time. The mystery of human nature itself becomes increasingly pressing as we contemplate these early behaviors. The same species that created beautiful art, that cared for the dead with ceremony and ritual, that made tools of exquisite craftsmanship. This same species also engaged in violence and warfare. The archaeological record contains evidence of interpersonal violence dating back hundreds of thousands of years. Neanderthal skeletons show evidence of injuries consistent with violence, and in some cases the injuries appear to have been inflicted by other Neanderthals. Early modern human burial sites sometimes show evidence of deliberate killing, of violence inflicted with stone tools or other weapons. Some scholars have argued that warfare was present even in early modern human groups, though others argue that the evidence is ambiguous, and that what we interpret as evidence of warfare may have been evidence of individual conflicts or executions, rather than organized warfare between groups. So, we are left with a picture of our ancestors that is complex and sometimes contradictory. They were capable of beauty and of brutality, of cooperation and of conflict, of symbolic thought and of practical problem-solving. They cared for their young and their elderly, but they also engaged in violence. They created art and music, but they also hunted and killed animals. They had beliefs about death and the afterlife, but they also accepted death as a normal part of existence. They were, in many ways, much like us. And yet they were also, in some ways, foreign to us, living in a different world, thinking different thoughts, pursuing different goals and dreams. The mysteries of human prehistory call to us across the vast span of time. They remind us that much of human history is hidden from us, that the lives of our ancestors are only partially visible in the scattered remains they left behind. And there is something deeply moving about this, the thought that countless generations of humans lived their lives, loved and struggled and died, and left almost no trace. The fact that we can know anything about them at all is remarkable. The fact that there is so much we cannot know is humbling. As we rest in the darkness and listen to the story of our ancestors, contemplating these mysteries, we engage in something deeply human, the attempt to understand where we came from, to connect ourselves to the vast span of history, to see ourselves as part of a story that stretches back through time. It is in this contemplation, in this wondering about the past, that we affirm our membership in the human community that stretches across time, connecting the ancient past to the present day. We have traveled now through millions of years of human prehistory, following our ancestors from the savannas of Africa through the emergence of tool-making, through the development of fire, through the creation of art and symbolic thought. But our journey is not yet complete. We must now leap forward past the slow millennia of hunter-gatherer existence to a period of dramatic and revolutionary change. We must arrive at the moment when humanity fundamentally transformed its way of life, when agricultural civilization emerged from the patterns of hunting and gathering that had dominated human existence for hundreds of thousands of years. Let us imagine ourselves approximately 12,000 years ago, in the Fertile Crescent, that arc of land stretching from the modern-day Persian Gulf through modern Iraq and Syria and into the Levant. The climate has just stabilized after the last ice age. The world is becoming warmer, wetter. New plants are appearing, plants with large, nutrient-rich seeds. These plants, wheat, barley, lentils, will change everything. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans had survived as hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, following the animals, gathering what plants the landscape provided. This way of life was, in many respects, remarkably successful. Human populations had spread across the entire world, adapted to virtually every climate and environment. In many ways, the hunter-gatherer life was characterized by relative abundance and relative leisure. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies suggest that people typically worked only a few hours per day to meet their food needs, leaving much of their time for socializing, creating art, and engaging in ceremonial activities. But the emergence of agriculture would change this fundamentally. Agriculture began when people started deliberately planting seeds, tending crops, and harvesting them on a large scale. This transition happened gradually, over many centuries. At first, people still moved seasonally, but they moved in predictable patterns, returning to the same locations year after year to harvest the plants they had cultivated. Eventually, people began to stay in one place year-round, living in permanent settlements. The cultivation of crops allowed for larger populations in smaller areas, as a given amount of land could support more people through agriculture than through hunting and gathering. Let us imagine a settlement in the Fertile Crescent, perhaps 10,000 years ago. The settlement is not large, perhaps a few hundred people, but it is permanent. Structures made of mud, brick, or stone provide shelter. Storage facilities hold grain from the previous harvest. Fields nearby have been cleared of natural vegetation and planted with domesticated crops. Domesticated animals, sheep, goats, cattle, have been brought under human control and are herded by groups of people. Life in this agricultural village is very different from the life of a hunter-gatherer. The day is structured around the demands of crops and animals. In the growing season, the fields require constant attention, weeding, irrigating, watching for pests. When harvest time comes, everyone works intensively, gathering the crops before they spoil or before they are destroyed by animals. The stored grain must be guarded, protected from theft and from decay. The animals require daily care. They must be herded, fed, watered, protected from predators. The labor is constant and often exhausting. Unlike hunter-gatherers, who typically worked only a few hours per day, agricultural people often worked from dawn to dusk during key seasons. The diet, while more reliable in terms of quantity, was often less diverse and less nutritious than the diet of hunter-gatherers. Diseases spread more easily in settled communities, where people lived in close proximity to each other and to their animals. The bones of early agricultural people, when examined by archaeologists, often show signs of poor nutrition and chronic disease, compared to the bones of contemporary hunter-gatherers. And yet, agriculture supported larger populations. More people could be fed from a given amount of land. This meant that the population increased. It also meant that not everyone needed to be involved in food production. Some people could be released from the necessity of producing food, and could specialize in other activities, making pottery, working with stone and metal, creating tools and weapons, performing rituals and ceremonies, administering the settlement, and keeping records. This specialization led to the emergence of social inequality. In a hunter-gatherer band, everyone had roughly similar access to resources. In an agricultural settlement, some people could accumulate more resources than others. Someone had to make decisions about how much grain to store, how to distribute it, when to plant and when to harvest. Someone had to organize large-scale projects, the building of irrigation systems, the construction of larger buildings, the organization of rituals and ceremonies. Someone had to make these decisions, and inevitably, whoever made these decisions also had power and privilege. Let us imagine a day in the life of two different people in this ancient agricultural settlement, showing the contrasts that emerge in an agricultural society. First, let us consider the day of a common farmer, a person of no particular status. He wakes before dawn, as the darkness is just beginning to give way to the first light. His family is still sleeping on mats in their mud-brick house. The settlement is beginning to wake. He can hear the sounds of others rising, animals being tended. He rises quietly and goes outside. His task today is to work in the fields, which are now in their growing season. The crops need to be checked for weeds, and any weeds that have emerged must be pulled. He takes with him a simple tool, a wooden stick hardened in fire suitable for digging. He walks with several other farmers to the fields outside the settlement. The morning is cool, the light is soft and golden. The fields are laid out in neat rows, the plants growing at roughly the same height and spacing. This represents an enormous change from the wild landscape where previously vegetation grew chaotically. Wherever conditions suited it, now humans have imposed order on nature, have created fields of uniform crops. The work of weeding is monotonous and backbreaking. He bends repeatedly, pulling weeds, throwing them aside. His hands become sore and dirty. The sun rises higher in the sky, and the day becomes hot. By midday, he and the other workers rest in whatever shade can be found, eating a simple meal of bread made from wheat, and perhaps some dried legumes. The work resumes in the afternoon. By evening, as the light fades, he returns to the settlement, exhausted. His muscles ache, his hands are raw, his back is strained. He eats in the evening, more bread, perhaps some vegetable, perhaps some meat if an animal has recently been slaughtered. He shares the meal with his family. After eating, there is little time for leisure. The light is fading, and without artificial light there is little to do but rest. He lies on his mat and attempts to sleep, though the soreness in his body makes sleep difficult. This is the rhythm of his life, repeated day after day, season after season. There are variations, sometimes. There is harvest time, when the work is intense and urgent, when everyone must work as hard as possible to gather the crops before they spoil. Sometimes there are ceremonies and rituals that mark important times in the agricultural calendar, but the fundamental pattern is one of constant labor, of working to feed himself and his family and to produce a surplus that can be stored or traded. Now let us consider the day of the settlement's leader, a person who has accumulated wealth and power, who has the authority to make decisions for the community. This person is not necessarily more intelligent or more skilled than the farmer, but circumstances, perhaps family connections, perhaps personal charisma, perhaps a display of prowess in hunting or warfare, have elevated them to a position of power. This leader wakes in a larger, more substantially built house. The interior is better appointed than that of the common farmer. There are more possessions, finer pottery, perhaps objects of prestige such as stone beads or shells traded from distant locations. He does not need to go to the fields himself. His status is such that others provide for him, and in return, he provides leadership and protection. His morning is occupied with administrative tasks. There are decisions to be made about the irrigation system, which fields should receive water, in what quantities, in what order. There are conflicts to mediate. Perhaps two families dispute over the boundaries of their fields, or perhaps someone is accused of stealing grain from the communal storage. There are ceremonies to plan. The time of the solstice approaches, and the leader must organize a ritual to mark this important astronomical event, to ensure that the sun continues its cycles and the crops continue to grow later in the morning. The leader meets with a small group of other important people, those who have accumulated enough status and resources to form something approaching an elite class. They discuss trade with distant settlements. They discuss the possibility of fortifying the settlement, given reports of conflicts and raiding in neighboring regions. They discuss the possibility of expanding into new territory, displacing or conquering neighboring communities. The afternoon brings more administrative tasks. The leader goes to the storage facility and checks the stored grain. He must estimate how much grain remains, and whether it will be sufficient to feed the population until the next harvest. He looks at records, marks made on clay tablets, simple notations that record quantities of grain, of animals, of other resources. These records are the beginning of writing, a development that will eventually lead to the complex writing systems of later civilizations. In the evening, the leader eats better than the common farmer. His meal includes multiple foods, bread, vegetables, meat from an animal, perhaps some honey or other sweet substance. He eats in greater quantity and greater variety. After eating, he has time for leisure. He may spend time with his family, may engage in conversation with other important people, may participate in games or other entertainment. His day is less exhausting, his life is more comfortable, his future is more secure. This contrast between the life of the common farmer and the life of the leader illustrates one of the most significant developments in human history, the emergence of social inequality. In prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies, while there might have been some differences in status and prestige, the differences were relatively modest. There were no dramatic differences in access to food and comfort and security. But in agricultural societies, the accumulation of resources in the hands of a few created the possibility for dramatic inequality. As settlements grew larger and more complex, this inequality became more pronounced. Agricultural societies could support craft specialists, people who made pottery, worked with metal, created weapons and tools. They could support priests or shamans, people who performed religious rituals and maintained spiritual knowledge. They could support warriors, people trained in the use of weapons whose task was to protect the community and to conduct raids against neighboring communities. And they could support an administrative class, people whose job was to manage the settlement, to keep records, to organize labor, to make decisions about resource distribution. All of these people, the craft workers, the priests, the warriors, the administrators, had to be fed by the surplus produced by agricultural laborers, and inevitably, the people at the top of this administrative hierarchy claimed the largest share of the surplus for themselves. This led to the emergence of hereditary elites, families whose members inherited power and prestige, and whose children were trained to take on leadership roles. As settlements grew larger and more complex, they eventually transformed into cities. The city represented a new level of complexity. A city might contain thousands or tens of thousands of people. It would have temples dedicated to gods, palaces where the rulers lived, markets where goods were bought and sold, workshops where craft workers made goods, storage facilities holding enormous quantities of grain. It would have walls to protect against raiders. It might have a standing army. It would have a sophisticated system of administration and record-keeping. The earliest cities emerged around 5,000 to 6,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in modern-day Iraq. Cities like Uruk, Ur, and Lagash developed complex systems of government, sophisticated trade networks, and monumental architecture. They had kings or high priests who exercised absolute authority over the population. They had laws that regulated behavior and punished those who violated rules. They had armies that conquered neighboring cities and brought them under their control. With the emergence of cities and civilization came the emergence of writing. Writing allowed information to be recorded and preserved. The earliest writing systems were developed to keep records, to note quantities of grain stored, of animals owned, of goods traded. But writing eventually became more complex and more flexible, allowing for the recording of ideas, stories, laws, and history. Writing made it possible for knowledge to be preserved and transmitted across generations in ways that were not possible with oral tradition alone. The development of civilization, then, is intimately connected to the development of agriculture, to the emergence of settled communities, to the accumulation of resources in the hands of an elite, and to the systems of control and administration required to manage complex societies. It is also intimately connected to warfare and conquest. Cities competed with each other for resources, for territory, for power. They conquered each other, enslaved each other's populations, and incorporated neighboring cities into larger political entities. The first empires emerged, large political entities ruled by a central authority, encompassing many cities and many populations. Civilization brought remarkable developments. It brought the development of writing, of complex architecture, of new technologies for working with metal and stone. It brought the development of complex religious systems, of art and literature, of mathematics and astronomy. It brought the possibility of specialization and the accumulation of knowledge, as scholars and priests could focus on learning and understanding the world rather than on the daily struggle for survival. But civilization also brought suffering. It brought slavery, the practice of forcing people to work against their will. It brought warfare on a large scale, conflicts between cities and between empires that involved thousands of people and resulted in thousands of deaths. It brought disease, as crowded cities were incubators for epidemic diseases. It brought starvation, as droughts could destroy crops and create famines that killed large populations. It brought the subordination of women, as patriarchal systems emerged in which men held power over women and passed property to their sons. It brought the brutality of control, the use of violence to enforce obedience, the public execution of those who violated laws or rebelled against authority. Let us now imagine a day in the life of someone living in an ancient city. perhaps Babylon or Memphis, or one of the other great cities of the ancient world, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. Let us consider the life of a merchant, someone of middling status, wealthier than a common laborer, but not part of the elite. Ruling class. He wakes in his house, a modest but decent structure of mud brick, in a neighborhood of the city where other merchants and craft workers live. His family is with him. His wife, his children, a slave or two who perform domestic tasks. He eats a quick breakfast and prepares for the day's business. His task is to acquire goods and trade them for profit. He has connections with other merchants, with craft workers, with farmers in the surrounding countryside. He buys goods in one location and sells them in another, making a profit on the difference. Today he is planning to visit the marketplace to purchase pottery, metalware, and textiles. These goods he will trade to merchants in a neighboring city, hoping to get a good price. The potential for profit is high, but so is the risk. Travel between cities is dangerous. Bandits and raiders frequently prey on merchants, and sometimes trade deals go badly, and merchants lose money instead of making it. He sets out in the morning with several servants who will carry goods and protect him on his journey. The city is crowded. He walks past hundreds of people, workers, slaves, other merchants, beggars. He passes elaborate temples and palaces, demonstrations of the power and wealth of the ruling class. He passes workshops where craftspeople labor, making pottery, working metal, weaving textiles. He passes streets lined with shops where goods are bought and sold. In the marketplace, he meets with other merchants and with craft workers who have goods to sell. He negotiates prices, inspects goods for quality, arranges for goods to be transported. The negotiations are complex. Prices are not fixed, but are determined through discussion and bargaining. He must assess the quality of goods, must estimate what price he can get for them in other cities, must account for the costs of transportation and the risks of the journey. By midday, the heat is intense. The marketplace is crowded and chaotic. He takes a break, eating some bread and drinking some beer, a beverage that is common in ancient cities and that is safer than water, which is often contaminated. In the afternoon, more negotiations, more inspections of goods. By evening he has completed his purchases and has arranged for them to be loaded onto donkeys or put into boats for transport. He returns home in the evening, tired from the day's negotiations. He eats dinner with his family, food that his wife has prepared or that a slave has prepared under her direction. The meal is better than that available to laborers, but not as elaborate as what the ruling elite enjoy. He has time in the evening for conversation with his family, perhaps for some entertainment. He might listen to a musician or a storyteller, if such entertainment is available. After dinner, he must do accounting. He has records written down, kept on clay tablets or on papyrus, that record his transactions. He must ensure that his accounts balance, that he knows exactly what profit or loss he has made. This accounting requires literacy, the ability to read and write, a skill that he has learned and that distinguishes him from the vast majority of the population, most of whom are illiterate. This man's life is quite different from that of a common laborer, but it is also precarious in ways that the lives of the ruling elite are not. He has wealth and status, but his wealth depends on the success of his trading, which depends on the stability of the political system, on the safety of trade routes, on the willingness of other merchants to trade with him. A war between cities could disrupt trade routes and destroy his livelihood. A change in leadership could alter the political landscape and make trading more difficult. He exists in a complex society with laws and customs, but also with hierarchies of power and privilege that he does not control. Let us also consider the life of someone at the bottom of the social hierarchy, a slave or laborer with no property of their own. This person wakes early, forced awake by their master or overseer. They have no choice about how to spend their day. They are forced to work. Perhaps they work in the fields of a wealthy landowner. Perhaps they work in the palace doing menial tasks. Perhaps they work in a workshop, making goods under the control of a craftsmaster. Their day is long and exhausting. They are given just enough food to keep them alive and capable of working. They have no time for leisure, no opportunity for profit, no hope of improving their condition. They belong to another person. much like a possession or an animal. The contrast between the merchant and the slave illustrates the enormous range of human experience that exists within a civilization. The same city contains people living in extraordinary comfort and wealth, and people living in the most abject poverty and degradation. The system that creates the wealth of the elite requires the labor of the poor and the enslaved. The order that makes civilization possible is maintained through the threat of violence. Those who try to escape slavery are punished. Those who violate the law are beaten or executed. Those who rebel against the system are crushed. And yet, despite its brutality and inequality, civilization brought remarkable developments. It brought the development of sophisticated systems of thought, philosophy, mathematics, astronomy. It brought the creation of great works of art and literature. It brought the development of complex technologies. It brought the accumulation of knowledge and the transmission of that knowledge across generations and across vast distances. Without civilization, without the development of cities and complex societies, human progress as we understand it would not have been possible. The journey from the prehistoric past to the ancient world of cities and empires is a journey from relative equality and relative leisure to inequality and labor, from small communities where everyone knew everyone else, to large cities where most people were strangers to each other. It is a journey from a way of life that had been stable for hundreds of thousands of years to a new way of life that has continued to develop and transform ever since. And the transformation did not stop with the ancient world. Over the past few thousand years, civilizations have risen and fallen, empires have conquered and collapsed, technologies have advanced, and human societies have become increasingly complex and interconnected. The agricultural revolution that began 12,000 years ago set in motion a series of changes that have led to the modern world with its cities and technologies, its institutions and complexities. Now, let us contemplate the contrast between the lives of our prehistoric ancestors and the lives we live today. Let us think about what has been gained and what has been lost in the transformation from prehistoric to modern. A prehistoric hunter-gatherer, if they could somehow be transported to the modern world, would find it almost incomprehensibly strange. The enormous cities would astound them, structures of glass and metal reaching toward the sky, far more sophisticated and elaborate than anything they could have imagined. The technology would seem like magic: electric lights, automobiles, airplanes, computers. The abundance of food in markets and stores would seem miraculous. Foods from all over the world, available year-round, in far greater variety than they would have ever encountered. And yet, some things would be familiar. They would recognize families, would see parents caring for their children, would recognize grief and joy and love and anger. They would understand competition and cooperation, would see both kindness and cruelty, would recognize the fundamental patterns of human social behavior. Our prehistoric ancestors lived simpler lives in some respects, but not necessarily better or worse lives. They worked less than we do. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest they spent only a few hours per day obtaining food. They had more leisure time, more time for socializing and creating art and engaging in ceremonies. They had strong community bonds, living in small groups where everyone knew everyone else. They had a deep connection to nature, understanding the landscape and the animals around them with an intimacy that most modern humans have lost. But their lives also had hardships that we have largely escaped. Infant mortality was very high. Many children did not survive to adulthood. Life expectancy was low. A person who survived to adulthood might hope to live to perhaps 50 or 60 years old, but many did not. Injuries and illnesses that we can easily treat with modern medicine often led to death. Famines could occur if food sources failed. Predators posed a constant danger. Modern life offers safety, comfort, and abundance that would have seemed miraculous to our ancestors. We have medical science that can treat diseases and injuries. We have technology that extends our lifespans and improves our health. We have food available year-round, in abundance. We have shelter that protects us from the elements. We have entertainment and education and opportunity that would have been impossible in prehistoric times. But modern life also brings stresses and challenges that our ancestors did not face. We live in large, complex societies, where we are unknown to most of the people around us. We spend much of our time working. Many of us work more hours per week than our ancestors worked per day. We are disconnected from nature and from the landscape. We face anxieties about money, about status, about the future. We are exposed to constant stimulation and information, which can be overwhelming. We compare ourselves to others constantly, through media and social networks, which can create feelings of inadequacy and dissatisfaction. Perhaps most significantly, modern life has given us the ability to reflect on our own existence, to contemplate our place in history and in the universe. Our ancestors, living in the moment and focused on survival, may not have had the luxury of this kind of existential reflection. But we, lying in our beds, comfortable and safe, have the opportunity to think about deep time, about the millions of years of history that connect us to our ancestors, about the vast universe that contains us. As we listen to the story of human evolution, as we contemplate the journey from our earliest hominid ancestors to modern humans, we engage in something profoundly human, the attempt to understand our own nature and our place in the world. We connect ourselves to this vast history, recognizing that we are the products of millions of years of evolution, of countless generations of ancestors who survived, who reproduced, who passed on their genes and their knowledge to their descendants. We are, in a very real sense, the embodiment of the entire history of humanity. The choices and struggles of our ancestors are written in our bodies and in our minds, and in understanding this, in contemplating the vast span of time that separates us from our earliest ancestors, there is something deeply peaceful. The petty concerns of our daily lives seem small in comparison to the vastness of deep time. The anxieties and stresses that occupy our minds seem less significant when we consider the struggles that our ancestors faced. The complexity of modern life seems less overwhelming when we remember that we are the products of incredibly sophisticated evolutionary processes that have been working for millions of years. As you listen to this, as you drift toward sleep, allow yourself to feel the weight of history, the connection that binds you to your ancestors, the peace that comes from understanding that you are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing. Your life, your struggles, your joys, your relationships, all of these are part of the great unfolding story of humanity. You are not alone in time. You are connected through an unbroken chain of ancestors stretching back millions of years to all that came before. We have journeyed together through an enormous expanse of time. We have traveled back through millions of years, visiting our ancestors in their daily lives, witnessing their struggles and their innovations, their hopes and their fears. We have seen the world transform from vast savannas inhabited by small, ape-like creatures to great cities filled with thousands of people. We have witnessed the emergence of tools, of fire, of art, of language, of civilization. And now, as we approach the end of our journey, we find ourselves returning to the present, to you, lying in the darkness, listening to the echo of deep time. Think for a moment about what you have learned. You are not separate from nature. You are not different in kind from the creatures that lived millions of years ago. You are the product of those creatures, their direct descendant, carrying within your body and within your mind the accumulated legacy of countless generations. The genes that you carry were carried before you by your parents, and by their parents, and by their parents before them, stretching back in an unbroken chain to the earliest humans, to the earliest primates, to the earliest mammals, to the earliest vertebrates, and ultimately to the first living organisms. The DNA that makes up your cells is nearly identical to the DNA of your closest living relatives, the other primates. It is remarkably similar to the DNA of all mammals, and still bears recognizable traces of relationship to the DNA of fish and other distant ancestors. Every cell in your body is a record of your evolutionary history, a document written in the language of genes that tells the story of your ancestry. And your mind, your consciousness, your capacity for thought and language and emotion, this too is the product of evolution. It was not created fully formed at some moment in history. It developed gradually, over millions of years, as brains got larger, as neural connections became more complex, as the capacity for abstract thought emerged. your ability to wonder about your own origins, to contemplate deep time, to feel awe and reverence in the face of the vastness of history. These capacities emerged from the same evolutionary processes that shaped your body. As you lie there in the darkness, listening to these words, you are engaged in something that no other creature on earth can do. You are reflecting on your own existence. You are contemplating your place in the vast scheme of things. You are connecting yourself to the past and imagining the future. This capacity for reflection, for contemplation, for abstract thought, this is perhaps the most fundamentally human trait, and yet it is important to remember that you are not fundamentally separate from other creatures. You are an animal, a mammal, a primate. You have the same basic needs as other animals: food, water, shelter, safety, social connection. You experience the same basic emotions: fear, joy, sorrow, anger, love. You are subject to the same physical laws that govern all matter. You will eventually die, as all living things do, and your body will return to the earth, its atoms becoming part of other organisms, participating in the great cycles of life and death that characterize the natural world. This is not a depressing thought. Rather, it is a humbling and clarifying thought. It reminds us that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. We are part of the web of life that connects all living things. We are part of the grand story of evolution that stretches back billions of years. We are part of the history of humanity, that story of our ancestors struggling and innovating and building civilizations. And we are part of the present moment, this immediate concrete experience of being alive. Think about your ancestors. The person or people who gave birth to your parents were your grandparents. Their parents were your great-grandparents. Go back far enough, and you reach people who lived in castles, who lived in simple villages, who lived in caves, who lived on the savanna under the African sun. Go back far enough, and you reach creatures that were not yet human, that were something between ape and human. Go back far enough, and you reach creatures that were not yet ape, that were something between primate and other mammal. Go back far enough, and you reach the earliest mammals, the earliest vertebrates, the earliest life forms. All of these beings led to you. You exist because of them. You are, in a very real sense, their continuation into the future. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson that the study of human evolution teaches us. We are not the culmination of evolution, the final goal toward which all of history has been working. Rather, we are a moment in an ongoing process, a chapter in a story that continues to unfold. The future of humanity is not predetermined. It depends on the choices that we make, on the paths we follow, on the way we treat each other and the world around us. But in this present moment, in the immediate present, there is nothing you need to do. There is no task awaiting you, no problem to solve. You have listened to the story of your deep past, the story of your ancestors, the story of how you came to exist. You have traveled back through millions of years, and now you have returned to the present moment. Feel the bed beneath you. Feel the way your body rests on the mattress, supported, secure. Feel the blanket or sheet covering you, providing warmth and comfort. Listen to the sounds around you, perhaps the quiet sounds of the night, perhaps the sound of breathing, perhaps the distant sounds of the city or the countryside. Feel the air on your skin, the temperature of the room around you. Be present in your body, in this moment, in this place. Your ancestors survived. They endured hardship and danger. They faced predators and starvation and disease. They persisted through climate change and disaster and conflict. They survived, and because they survived, you exist. In a very real sense, your existence is a gift from all of them. You are here because of them. You carry them with you, in your body and in your mind, as you feel yourself drifting toward sleep. Remember this. You are connected to the vast history of life on this planet. You are connected to all of your ancestors, stretching back through time. You are part of something much larger than yourself. And in this knowledge, there is peace, there is comfort, there is a sense of belonging to something profound and eternal. Let your thoughts drift now. Let the vast span of time that you have traveled through settle into your mind like sediment in water, gradually becoming part of you, Let the story of human evolution become part of your internal landscape, a landscape that you carry with you even in sleep. Let the weight of deep time, the knowledge of millions of years of history, become a comfort rather than a burden. You are safe, you are secure, you are connected to all that came before. As your eyes grow heavier and your breathing slows, know that your ancestors rest in you. The struggles they endured have made your comfort possible. The innovations they developed have allowed you to have this peaceful moment, lying safely in the darkness. The knowledge they accumulated, passed from one generation to the next, has flowed down to you and will flow from you to the future. The sun that warmed your ancestors on the African savanna still exists. The same plants that they gathered still grow in different forms in the world. The same animals that they hunted and feared and learned to live alongside still exist in different forms. The same sky that held their attention, the same stars that guided their movements, still shine above. Everything is connected. Everything is continuous. There is only one story, one vast unfolding narrative, and you are part of it. Let yourself drift now into sleep, carrying with you the knowledge of your deep past. Let the peace of deep time settle over you. Let the vast history of humanity rock you to sleep like a lullaby, the accumulated whispers of millions of ancestors, singing to you, welcoming you into the great continuity of life. You are safe. You are home. You are part of something eternal. Sleep now. Rest. Let go. Your story will continue, as the stories of all your ancestors have continued, as the story of humanity will continue into the future. But for now, in this moment, simply rest. Simply be. Simply sleep. The journey is complete. You have traveled back through time and returned to the present. Now let yourself slip gently into the peace of unconsciousness, carrying with you the wisdom of the ages, the knowledge of your place in the grand scheme of things. Sleep now. Sleep well.